A headline to hit immediately. And look, I'm skeptical because I heard what the NCAA did and said when NIL was allowed, right? But Supreme Court, they took a step back and they pointed to the individual institutions, the individual programs, the individual conferences. And now the headline from Sports Illustrated and Ross Dellenger, who joins us. The doors are opening for NCAA to close in on NIL violations. Ross, is this directly in response to what we've seen from Florida, what we've seen from Rashada, or is it more than this?
Not necessarily. So this has been in the works actually for several months. We know that, I kind of take you through the timeline. July 2021, obviously we all know that's when NIL began. And around spring of 2022, so around this time last year, we saw, the recruiting cycle, the first recruiting cycle with NIL end. And we saw a lot of, obviously, NIL related issues arise from administrators to coaches. We can go back to the May flap kind of between Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher. And there was a lot of public outcry from coaches and administrators to have the NCAA begin enforcing NIL and NIL related rule breaking. So it really goes all the way back to pretty much last spring. And that kind of led to this past October when the NCAA passed a lowering of the standard of a violation. So basically, it gives investigators, NCAA investigators, a little more leeway to charge schools with a violation around NIL. And that took effect January 1, but it was actually passed in October. So well before the Rashada stuff. But the Rashada stuff is certainly the exact kind of issue that administrators and coaches around the country want the NCAA to investigate and prosecute and levy penalties against.
Ross, it doesn't surprise me that what was intended to be NIL, name, image, likeness, very quickly became pay for play with these teams and with these collectives. But what does surprise me a bit is how quickly it was reported on as such, that it was just accepted fact that this is the value of a player. This is what's rumored that they're getting to go to this school. This is what it's going to cost to get another player. And there was no real subterfuge in terms of what was going on. Is the scope of that coverage and the way we've talked about it in the media, is that a big part of this, that people aren't even hiding it in terms of pay for play?
Well, I think it is. I think it's a combination of media coverage of NIL and NIL recruiting. But in order to have media coverage and stories, you obviously need sources. And there's been a lot of people, whether it's those taking part in the NIL recruiting and rule breaking, or those victimized by the NIL or NIL rule breaking, that are talking. Some of them not even behind the guise of anonymity. Some of them are talking publicly. Boosters, NIL collective CEOs talking about the issues and what's going on, what we're seeing, which is, NIL being used in recruiting. And, whether it's agents or administrators or boosters or coaches or NIL executive types, collective executives, you are seeing a lot of people talking publicly about NIL in private, in public, and on the record, and off the record. There's a lot of discussion about it, and it's probably because it's new, and people have been shocked by it in a way, or because they're victims of it, or for whatever reason they're angry because some other school is offering more than they did. So there's a lot of finger pointing. School A is pointing the finger at school B, and guess what? School B is pointing the finger back at school A.
Ross Dellenger, our guest, a Sports Illustrated senior college football writer. And in many cases, to further what you're saying, it's the player, or the player's family discussing how they are not getting paid and what they want to do about it, and that's why I immediately think Rashada. But also, like the Drake May rumor, where he's going to get $5 million to transfer to one of these SEC schools.
Pat Narduzzi started that.
Yes,
Pitt's head coach mentioned that.
So, with that in mind, we know how slow the NCAA is at investigating literally anything. How are they going to retroactively go back and police this in theory, and the timetable for which it's necessary to actually get a grasp on this?
Well, I think cases that they've closed are not going to be reopened.
Okay.
The retroactive is an interesting question. I think whatever they investigate from here on out, if it's an active investigation, I think they're going to use the standard of the violation. And to kind of explain a little bit about what that is, the NCAA before this rule change needed on the record sourcing or on the record documentation to go to a school and to allege a violation. Now they can use circumstantial evidence, maybe a tip, maybe an anonymous tip, maybe a news story, a media report. They can use that now and go to the school alleging a violation, and it's up to the school. It's the burden of the schools to prove that it's not a violation. So it makes it a little easier to allege violations, which you would think, and the hope is from the NCAA side and many in college athletics, that it will lead to more investigations, more successful investigations with allegations of violations and subsequently penalties. However, I think one of the issues still with outstanding is, what will the penalties be, and will they be impactful at all? Will they send a message and stop the rule breaking behavior around the country? And I'm not so sure about that. They cannot. The NCAA has no authority over private companies like collectives or boosters, private individuals. And so the plan, I think, is to penalize schools with fines and potentially require schools to disassociate from boosters who are breaking rules, allegedly breaking rules. So it'll be really interesting. That's going to be the real test when the NCAA levies its first, penalties. What will they be, and will they really affect how everyone else around the country is doing business?
It's very interesting, the point you bring up on the potential of them telling the school to disassociate when they're not going to be able to tell the player to do that. They're right. I mean, the player can associate based on name, image, likeness with who he or she chooses. And then the school is at odds with that, at least in theory, outside of the stadium, right? Like whatever the rules are, the players can represent themselves in this. And the NCAA is so afraid of being sued. And again, I don't blame them for that based on what happened with the Supreme Court. It's an interesting pool to jump back into.
Yeah, well, and I left off the issue with the players right there. They've announced, the NCAA has basically announced that when it comes to NIL related penalties, players will not be penalized. Their athletic eligibility will not be penalized. And the NCAA is moving away from postseason ban type stuff and scholarship reductions as well, because again, that hurts players. So anything they do that really impacts or hurts players specifically, they're probably not going to do, because of the era that we're in, the kind of athlete rights type of movement that we've seen, as you mentioned, partly because of the courts, Supreme Court Alston ruling, and also the state lawmakers that have passed all these NIL laws. It's just a situation right now where athletes, the pendulum has swung, so to speak. So the NCAA is not going to penalize athletes, and that leaves only, and again, they can't, as I mentioned before, they can't penalize boosters and private companies really. So that leaves the schools to be penalized with some kind of fines. And I think that's probably the only, I think that's probably what happens. And it'll be interesting to see what impact that has around the country. But you're right, players are kind of getting off here, right? And that's, for so long, players didn't have a whole lot of rights within college sports, and now we're seeing them have those. And some people might say it's too much, but for years and years and decades, they didn't have many rights at all, and they obviously weren't paid, despite their coaches making millions of dollars, and even administrators making millions of dollars.
Chad, I wonder, will the fines levied towards the penalties levied towards the institutions, the schools, be more or less than what the SEC would fine for storming the field?
It's a great question. And also, by the way, we know that the NCAA is about to have a new president coming in. All's quiet on the Big Ten commissioner search right now, Ross. How different is it covering a story? You as a reporter in college football, where you're covering a collection of school presidents that are out there trying to make a decision on a commissioner, as opposed to covering any job search where it's AD, president, boosters surrounding it? And are you hearing anything on the possible next Big Ten commissioner?
Not really. They just announced a couple days ago, I believe, maybe last week, that they just announced a search firm that they'll use. Turnkey will be running the search, which Turnkey ran several other searches of major college positions lately. They ran the search, or helped run the search, of the NCAA president that was hired, who came from outside of college athletics. They helped run the search of the Pac-12 commissioner, George Kliavkoff, came from outside of college athletics. They helped run the search of the Big 12. Brett Yormark was hired, again, outside of college athletics. So you're seeing a theme there when Turnkey is involved in a search. And the last time the Big Ten made a hire, obviously, they hired someone from outside of the college sports world. So that all that said, I get just a sense that the Big Ten might take it a different direction this time, and hire somebody from within college sports. But you hear both sides. You hear people say that the Big Ten should go the way of other commissioners in the NCAA president and hire somebody within this industry. But you also hear that it's good to get an outside perspective. However, given the fact that they went outside for the last commissioner hire, and some would say that there were issues that certainly cropped up, especially between Kevin Warren and the athletic director room within the Big Ten, that they need somebody within the industry this time around. So I lean toward that. That's what's going to happen. But certainly Jim Phillips, the ACC commissioner, has to be a candidate, you would think. He finished runner-up, basically, to Kevin Warren in the search a few years ago, and then landed the ACC job. So a lot of people, especially a lot of people in that athletic director room at the Big Ten, thought that Jim Phillips should have been hired a few years ago as the Big Ten commissioner. So that'll be an interesting one to watch.
Ross, I'm curious your take on this. From the perspective of which way they turn for the hire, which way do you think the SEC hopes they go as the direct competitor for superiority in college sports?
Well, I don't know. I guess the SEC. Yeah, I mean, these two entities, the Big Ten and the SEC, certainly are the two juggernauts of college sports right now. And there's, in a lot of ways, they don't like each other much. I think there have been some shots that have been taken publicly, and it's pretty obvious that they're becoming, if they haven't been for years, pretty staunch rivals. And this feels like a territory grab. When it comes to conference realignment with both programs we've seen the last year. So, I don't know. I'm for the health of all of college sports. I'm sure the SEC would like a hire that of a person who does not want to continue to expand the league. And wants to, you've heard Greg Sankey say quite a bit that he wants to preserve college sports on a national scale. And so to do that, you need somebody that is going to stick with the 16 and not continue to expand like it was kind of suggested that Kevin Warren actually wanted to do is keep expanding.
Did you think Jim Harbaugh was going to the NFL?
It's 2 years in a row now. We've had stories come out saying that if Jim Harbaugh would have gotten an NFL offer, he would have taken it. Uh, it's a weird story because I don't know what college coach outside of a handful would not take a job in the NFL if offered to him. So it's kind of obvious. But it seemed like over the last 2, 3, maybe even 4 years that, yeah, Jim Harbaugh wanted to return to the NFL. And I think it's kind of one of those things where the ball is in the NFL's court and they just haven't asked him to play.
So strange, though. Chad and I were discussing yesterday how the Broncos reportedly flew to Ann Arbor for a face-to-face with him. And normally when you fly in, you fly back with your guy. I mean, that's in college coaching searches, that's what goes on, and they didn't. And that part is very intriguing to me. The fact that the Broncos came to him and he didn't leave to go back to Denver.
We have breaking news, by the way, on that front.
Okay, go
from
ahead.
Adam Schefter. Saints and Broncos are finalizing compensation in return for Super Bowl winning head coach Sean Payton to be the next Broncos head coach. So there may be a reason why Jim Harbaugh, Ross, is not the head coach in Denver.
Well, I think he turned him down.
There
and
you go.
They've circled back again. Instead of going to the next guy, they're circling back to the guys who have turned them down, which has been DeMeco Ryans and, in this case, Harbaugh. Now back to Peyton, who's going to own the franchise, basically. He's going to own Walmart now. Ross, appreciate the perspective, man. It's always great. Keep up the great work. I think in large part, the digging that goes on behind the scenes is less and less nowadays, and you do a great job at that. We appreciate you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, man. There's Ross Dellenger of SI.